I thought I'd get a bit Buddhist on you today. So, the last video I made was about the discomfort that comes along with the awakening process and how to regard it, and the value of just accepting the fact that parts of this process are going to be uncomfortable. I'll put the link in the corner if you haven't seen that video. So as a follow-up video, I wanted to discuss a stage of realization where engaging discomfort very directly, getting to the root of discomfort, and ultimately finding an end to what makes us suffer for the most part. While what we're going to discuss is valuable to anyone who's interested, it comes into play after we've had an awakening and we've clarified that experience to some degree, particularly once we've had a taste of no self, or seen that the sense of being a separate entity or separate self is ultimately hollow. This doesn't mean that we'll have no sense of self. In fact, often there's more selfing that goes on beyond that recognition. However, it clears the way for us to investigate things in a more specific or direct way. So this topic refers to investigating the nature of suffering and equanimity. And specific to that, I want to briefly mention a principle in Buddhism called the Aggregates, or the skandhas. And quite simply, they are a description of the factors that make existence and experience possible. So physical form and consciousness and sort of everything that comes in between, where consciousness is impressed upon by physical existence. There are 5 skandhas, or 5 aggregates. But I want to talk about 2 of them specifically because they illustrate a very interesting point about experience. Now, even if you're not interested in Buddhism, or you know more about Buddhism than I do, which a lot of people do, and think I'm using these terms in a blunt way, I probably am. However, what I really want to point to isn't doctrine. I want to point to your experience, your immediate experience of comfort and discomfort, of will, of volition, of feeling like you're pushing or pulling on your experience, or feeling like things are out of sorts, or generally feeling dysphoric in life. So to piggyback off the previous video, after awakening, we start to realize that when we feel comfort or discomfort, when we feel peace or joy or sadness or grief or shame or clarity or contraction, isn't really our choice. We start to really sense this freedom in a sense, but the freedom isn't our freedom to do what we want. The freedom is in the freedom of experience to be however it is, to experience itself however it does right now. And sometimes this is to our dismay, that after we've had a significant insight, we realize we have far less control than our minds had imagined we did, or at least we're not in control in the same way we had thought we were at all. And of course that can be a bit disconcerting, but you do get used to it. The beauty of this is when you see that you're not really in control of how you feel at any given moment, just as you're not in control of the conditions of the moment, you have an opportunity to start to see what it is about that causes suffering. Another way of saying it is, you can answer the question, is suffering intrinsic to this truth that we can't control the momentary conditions, and we can't even really control our response to it directly most of the time? Is that suffering inherent in the experience or the conditions that change constantly? Even another way of saying it is, clearly, things change all the time. They're in flux all the time. Existence is transient in nature. So do those truths inherently cause suffering for the human? This is what we're investigating. And of course, the answer is no. Suffering is not inherent in experience. Suffering is not inherent in experiences that change, and even in experiences that change unpredictably. Suffering is not inherent in gain or loss. Suffering is not inherent in having no control over the momentary conditions. And this is a really good thing once we clarify what equanimity really is all about. So back to the skandhas or aggregates. The second aggregate is called Vedana. It's a Pali word. The interpretation or translation is something like feeling or feelings. But it doesn't mean emotions, and it doesn't even mean direct sensations in the body. It actually means the most basic experience of a certain sense experience that we can have. And it's broken down into pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So that's the second skandha. That sounds, sensations, tastes, all of these sensory experiences will have some sort of a tone of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Now the fourth aggregate is called Sankara, and it is interpreted roughly as mental formations, fabrications, volition. And what that means, or how it's explained typically, is how we feel about what we're experiencing and what we're going to do about it. What our tendencies are around the experiences. And that materializes into beliefs about those types of experiences, beliefs about our reactions to them, beliefs about whether or not we have to have reactions to them. So you could say the contact point between the second and fourth aggregate is somewhere between an experience being enjoyable or not enjoyable and us having a position in relation to it, or us feeling like we should have more of that or should have less of that, or like we want it or don't want it, which quickly leads into ideas of control and manipulation of our environment, et cetera, et cetera. So what I wanted to point out in this video is something very simple, and that is, if you look into your experience with a specific trigger, pick anything, or just wait till it comes up. Wait till you feel contracted or triggered or have a strong experience or reaction to your environment, and then just look at this. What I'm pointing out is a very specific and very simple thing that we can all relate to, and that is this. An experience being pleasant or unpleasant does not equate to wanting it or not wanting it. However, we are habituated to have those impressions velcroed together. They seem like they are literally one and the same. It doesn't seem like there's a gap between something being pleasant or unpleasant and me in quotation marks, wanting it or not wanting it. And this is a very, very important distinction, especially when you're investigating equanimity. Because one of those impressions, meaning the impression of it feels good or it doesn't feel good, it's pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, says nothing about me. It says nothing about an individual. However, Sankara, the experience of wanting more of it, wanting less of it, what am I going to do about it, what it means to me, all of that implies a self that refers to. And it reinforces the sense of a self immediately. So a key practice and a very good way to look into this can be notice when something feels comfortable or uncomfortable. And it helps to start with things that are slightly uncomfortable or slightly more comfortable instead of things that are intense, like intense pleasure or intense pain. But just notice if something feels slightly uncomfortable. Where does the wanting come in? Where does it become what I want or what I don't want? Is there a gap there? Is it possible to actually notice the sensation just as it is, even noticing that you may have a tendency to recoil from it, the body may want to move away from it, or it's just not particularly pleasant, and look at where does that become, I want less of it. It shouldn't be there. And then further narratives about why I don't deserve this, why I'm being put upon by others or life or my circumstances. Just notice that cascade. But try to back up until you can actually stay at that point where a physical sensation can be in the body somewhere, it can be an emotional reaction, but the sensation of it itself, or the overall sense experience of what's happening right now that may feel slightly unpleasant. See if you can just sit with it for a few minutes before it becomes something you don't want. Notice that you actually need thoughts to not want it. But to have a physical experience that's just not particularly pleasant doesn't require any thinking. It's more like implicit in the sensation, whereas wanting or not wanting, believing it should not be there or it should be there, that is more implicit to thinking, to mind, to thoughts. And having a willingness to stay in this gap between Vedana, or the second aggregate, or the initial impression of favorable or not favorable sensation-wise, and Sankara, which is the mental formations or the beliefs about what's happening to me, what I should do about it, why I shouldn't have to go through it, or I should get more of it. Notice there's a gap there. It's not absolutely necessary to move into that story of liking or not liking, wanting or not wanting, should and shouldn't. And this is an uncomfortable gap at first. In fact, it may remain uncomfortable for some time, but it's tolerable as long as we don't get too entangled in the thoughts. You'll notice a physical reaction often. The body will react. It might even contract. And it's okay. Stay there. That's actually a good sign that your attention is in the right place. It's in the raw discomfort. But there's a lot to learn in this raw discomfort. And I don't mean learn intellectually or cognitively, but to learn experientially, to learn what not to do, to learn we don't actually have to react. That reaction is a mental formation. Reaction to experience is a mental formation. Reaction that feels like you. Reaction that feels contracted, like suffering. Physical movement of the body to move away from something that's slightly unpleasant is not the reaction I'm talking about. That can happen simply and fluidly and spontaneously with no internal contraction. So this simple practice can be very helpful if you make a habit of it. And again, after a shift, after some deepening of realization, you're in good territory to work like this, because you can clearly see the difference between a thinking state and a non-thinking state. You recognize the signature of thought and see when it starts to catch attention. And you're able to stay right in the contact point of experience without turning it into something about me. And the first way we turn it into something about me is I want it or I don't want it, instead of it's just pleasant or unpleasant. So see if you can find that gap or that distinction, and see if you can sit with it. Notice the reaction is not necessary. And doing this little by little, you'll find that you get better at it, and that you notice it will apply itself in other areas of your life.